We go. Okay, so hello everybody. Thank you for joining this session where we have wonderful speakers that I will introduce in a minute. So to give a bit of context, this is part of a learning activity that the consortium called Social SDG created in the perspective as part of the Erasmus Plus project that we are part of. So the other people that you actually see in the call are members of this consortium, and they have different backgrounds. So academia, NGOs, small companies, schools as well. And they're all here to... Can you hear me? Yes? Yeah, okay. They are all here to listen and learn from your experience on the field with SDGs, and hopefully they will have also some questions. So I will start sharing a bit my screen, so you can actually see my presentation. And today, do you see my screen first? Yes?
Yes, we can see your screen.
Fantastic. So as you can see, our project, Social SDG, focuses on the social innovation and social part of the Sustainable Development Goals. So differently from other projects that, in general, put a lot of emphasis on the environmental aspects, and we also see, the TCFD as well, and the European Commission that are focusing their policy-making activity on the environmental aspects and climate change primarily. There is a big set of challenges that are related to the social dimensions of business, but also economic systems. So the whole idea behind our project was to investigate more those social dimension. And today, this webinar is in particular about SDG8, which is one of the most important, although not my favorite. I would say that if I were to pick an SDG, my favorite would be SDG12, but that's fine. My former university is working on SDG12, and it's part of the consortium, so I'm happy nonetheless. But today, to really foster this sharing of knowledge, we have two outstanding speakers, and thank you again for making the time to join this call. So from the corporate world, we have Victor Garcia from Aviva, and Victor will introduce himself, in a bit, but is an expert on modern slavery and supply chains in particular. He just told us that he was working on a benchmark today, so his hands are really on the field, and I'm sure his contribution is going to be awesome for us. And then more on the academic side, we have Kevin, who is a PhD student at London Business School, also working on SDGs, but in general, corporate sustainability. And we work together also on some research projects. Also, there are a lot of exciting stuff. And we are making sure, in terms of time management, that there is plenty of time before the end of the call for you to interact with our speakers. You can ask them questions. All right, some housekeeping. I think I already covered part of this. The webinar will be published online, because this is also part of the requirements of the European Union. This is a European funded project as well. And we have a dedicated hashtag for social media. And the questions, please keep the questions for the end, so we can keep the flow of the webinar. As of me, you already know me. I'm a data governance director of innovation. An accountant as background, but really with a passion and interest for sustainability, and in particular materiality. That's my main area of research. So we all know the Sustainable Development Agenda and the SDGs. So let's go straight to SDG8. So I thought, to start with, probably the best way is to present very quickly what is the status, what is the progress of Goal 8 in 2018, and there is no better way to do it than looking at the official source, which is the Sustainable Development Goals report in 2018. And I took some freedom, to highlight some of the goals of the progress that really struck me. So labor productivity grew at global level and is growing, at the fastest rate since 2010, which is, remarkable. It means that economy is working, and in a way, the economic system is contributing to SDG8. I found interesting the second point in particular, as 61% of all workers were engaged in informal employment in 2016. We know that working, especially in some sectors, is becoming more fluid. We all know about the Deliveroo's, the Ubers, in terms of what an employment relationship looks like today. And it seems that the traditional rules are being challenged by these new models. And also regulators don't often have the right answer to address the labor rights implications of these new ways of working. And then 2 points regarding gender equality. As you know, gender equality is really another goal, is SDG 5, but in SDG 8, which is about labor, there are a lot of overlapping between those two dimensions. And we will never probably discuss enough about gender pay gap. So in data from 45 countries suggests that gender inequality is still pervasive, and that's something that needs to be addressed. And not all companies and societies are really taking action on this point. And that is, I read that really in relation to the following point concerning access to banks and other financial institution services, and also hearing Victor's perspective on this would be interesting. Across all regions, women lag behind men in this regard, meaning having an account or in a bank or in another financial institution. And then the third point is more about intergenerational equality. Youth are 3 times more likely to be unemployed than adults. So it seems that there are some conditions that tell us that the next generation will not necessarily be better off than the previous one, which is a challenge from a sustainable development perspective. And finally, the last point is really my comment, because when I read the Sustainable Development Goals report in relation to SDG8, I didn't find any highlight on forced labor and modern slavery, which are one of the most concerning points about managing supply chains and making sure that the economic system is fair to everyone. And on that note, as I said, I want to keep this short and provide some insights that can spark the discussion. I would like to pass the word. Victor, probably you're the best person, to take over from, that remark on forced labor, and we are all curious to hear your perspective on it.
Well, thank you very much, Donato. Yeah, and thank you also for your very kind words. I wouldn't consider myself an expert, but I am a passionate person working in a corporation, trying to get human rights, and within that, modern slavery taken seriously. I'm very lucky to be working for a company that truly believes in behaving responsibly. We haven't got everything correct. We haven't got everything right, but we do strive to do things to the best of our possibilities. So a little bit about the company, so that for those who are not very familiar with Aviva, we are a insurance company. We provide life, general insurance, health insurance services, but we also have a asset management business, which is called Aviva Investors. We are in a different markets in Europe, Asia, Canada, and the UK. Have about 33 million customers, and we strive, as I said, to do the best we can in terms of being a responsible business. Um, about my role, I sit in the group center. I'm responsible for Aviva's approach to human rights, as well as working on issues around business ethics and reporting. So I get a bit of variety from my role. Thank you again for inviting me to talk about this, about Aviva's experience working in the area of modern slavery. So I'm going to share a bit of what we've done, a bit of my views, and then I'll be very happy to take any questions towards the end of the call. So, as I said, Aviva has businesses in the UK, in Europe, in Asia, and in Canada. And we know that in all these different regions, we have issues of forced labor, or more widely defined as modern slavery. We know that around the world there are about 40 million people under different forms of slavery. We know that in the UK, it is estimated that around 13,000 people are under slave-like conditions, and these numbers are much higher in some other countries where we are present. So what are we doing about it? For us, there are two sides to the areas of risk. The first one is ourselves as a business. You know, what is the risk that we have within our own immediate business operations, with the people we employ directly, with the people that work in our buildings, with the people that work delivering our services. And then there is another area of risk, which is external. This has to do with our suppliers, how it is that we work with our suppliers, how it is our suppliers treat their own employees, but also goes a little bit beyond and looking at, our investments. How it is that we place our money in different projects and investments, and what do we do to ensure that we have appropriate due diligence in those areas. Internally, we think our risk of modern slavery, forced labor, or issues like that are very low. We are in the services industry. Our employees are mostly people dealing with office type jobs. It is very unlikely to find someone who works, for example, as an underwriter, or someone who is a personal assistant, or someone who is on a call center, who might have been recruited under slave-like conditions, or who might be being exploited by a third party. I'm not saying it's completely impossible, but I'd say is highly unlikely and very low risk. However, we do have people working in our business, in our buildings. We have people serving our food in the restaurants. We have people cleaning our floors and toilets and etc. We have people providing security, etc. These people are not employed directly by the business. They are outsourced as part of our outsourced services, and they provide services to us via our suppliers. And that takes us to the second big chunk of areas of risk. And we think our biggest risks lie with our suppliers. We do not think we have, as far as we understand, extremely high risk pockets with the suppliers that we work with, but this understanding may change as we are starting to understand how it is that our supplier chain is structured, how it is that our supplier chain works. So what have we done then to understand our suppliers and how they work? We have a procurement function that works with our suppliers. They look into when we are onboarding a supplier, when we are welcoming a new supplier, we have a series of due diligence that we perform. We look at their financial performance. We look at, how long they've been working, but we also look at what sort of infrastructure they have in place to ensure that they have a level of respect for their workers' rights. And this has to do with understanding whether they, what the human resources policies are like, whether they have a human rights policy, and etc. But then we go a bit beyond that. We identify suppliers that might be on the higher end of our risk spectrum. For example, suppliers that provide us with car valeting services, so people who wash and clean the cars, or people who are working on building sites, or people who are providing highly manual services to suppliers that then provide those services to Aviva. We identify them and we go and do assessments. These assessments consist of visits to the supplier, to talk to management, to understand their recruitment processes and get a better idea on when the potential risk or where the potential risk may lie. Also, walking on the floor of the warehouse, if there is one, or the places where they are providing the services to Aviva, talking to employees about their life, how they are doing. And as a result of this, we get a better understanding of the activities of our supplier, and also things that we can learn from a supplier, as well as things that we can suggest a supplier take into consideration. And I'll give you a quick example. I think I have 15 minutes, Donato, is that correct?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so I have another 5 minutes, so I'll try and be good with my time. An example is, before doing all the work to understand our suppliers, as part of our approach to human rights or modern slavery, we didn't know, most of us in Group Center, we didn't know that we had car valeting services in our supply chain. If you think about an insurer, what does an insurer have to do with a cleaning cars type of services? Most people say was nothing, but that's not true. That's not correct, because as part of our business, we have a company that provides the repairs as well of cars when there is an accident. So if we provide car insurance and you have an accident in your car and your car is damaged, we will, come pick up the car, take it to our garage, repair it, and then before we send it back to you, the car has to be cleaned. Otherwise, you are not going to receive a spotless, newly refurbished or newly repaired car. So it's in that part of the process that we have people who do the cleaning of the car, which is known as valeters. So we didn't know. We identified this company. We had an interview with management. Management did not know that they were a high risk area, car washing in the UK, and that's because they are people who usually sits in the office, the manager and the HR person, who don't necessarily go out to the different sites where the people they are employing are performing their roles. So they are well-intentioned, but they didn't really have the awareness that this was a big issue in the industry. However, when we spoke to one of the area managers, the area manager, a person who's been looking after people in different areas in the car valeting industry, knew this well. And he told us, what he would do to make sure that the people that work for him were being treated safely. So he would go and talk to them in their house. He will try and speak to them individually. He will pay attention on whether they come with the same translator or the same cousin, because that was one of the signs. If you get someone, say Donato brings a person who is keen to work here, and then Donato brings another 2 people next week, and then Donato brings another 3 people next week, and he translates for them, they get the job. That could be a sign that Donato, sorry for using you as an example, Donato. Yeah, it could be a sign that Donato might be, involved in people trafficking. It doesn't mean that he will, but he could be. Then another sign was a very simple sign to identify was that in the HR systems, the employees should not more than one employee should not have the same bank account. And when we asked management whether they had any controls in their HR systems, they didn't, and they didn't know that creating a flag in their system for same address for more than one people and same bank account could very easily give them some signals of potential irregularities. So they said, we'll implement that. It's very easy. The system already has the potential. It's just that we didn't know we could do it. So they started doing it. That's a very small, simple example of some of the work that we've been doing with our suppliers. And this year, we are doing more of those assessments in the UK, as well as in each of our markets. So in France, we'll have at least 4 of these assessments. In Singapore, at least another 2, and etc. For most people looking at the big corporate like Aviva and the number of assessments or the work that we do with the suppliers, they could be tempted to say, well, those are very low numbers, why would a big company not be doing all your suppliers being assessed, in 1 year? Well, the response is, being completely open and honest, is that we are a very young industry in terms of managing the risks around modern slavery. Historically, we haven't really been engaged in this area in the same way as the likes of retailers like Marks and Spencer's or Unilever have, because for them it's been a very big salient risk. For us, it's relatively new. And another one is that we need to build capability in our supply chains, so, with our procurement as well team. So you cannot just go out and tell your procurement teams to assess 10% of their suppliers, which could be in the hundreds. You have to start slowly, but start well. So we are also doing training to our procurement people, as well as relationship managers, as well as colleagues in our legal team, and etc., etc. So we are doing that. We are doing running. We are running training. We are looking at our internal processes to make sure that we make it as tight as possible, and we also making sure that we treat our suppliers fairly. So that links me to another point, which is we make sure that we try and pay our suppliers on time, particularly to the small and medium-sized ones, because that's where you have sometimes a lot of tension. If the supplier, which is a small supplier or medium-sized supplier, is not paid in time, that can have a knock-on impact in them, and that could also have an impact on their workforce. So we try and be responsible about paying on time. We are also in the UK committed to the living wage. So the living wage is being paid more than the minimum legal. So it's being paid more based on a calculation of what a person needs to be able to live with dignity in a certain country. And we're looking at how we can implement something similar in other countries. So all of this work will continue developing. There is quite a lot more that we need to do. We are learning in the process. We are collaborating with other corporates and with non-for-profit organizations and government as well. And I think I'm come probably close to my closing time, Donato. Is that correct? Or
perfectly on time.
Fantastic.
Yeah,
so that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Victor, and thank you also for bringing SDG8 to life in a way. It's not easy, and I think your perspective it's very interesting, because when someone thinks to insurance, forced labor, modern slavery are definitely not the first things that come to mind. As you explained, your employees mostly work in office. So what are the implications for the industry? And you explained that very well with fantastic examples. I'm sure there will be questions after, but in the meantime, let me pass the word to Kevin. And I also stopped sharing my screen, so he will be able to share his screen and show his presentation too. Over to you, Kevin.
Great. Thanks a lot, Donato. Great. Thanks a lot, Donato. Let me just share my screen, and I'll put my slides up. And actually, Victor's comments there actually highlight some of the points that I will talk about, but I'll be coming at it from a slightly different angle. So first of all, my name's Kevin Chuah. I'm a PhD student at London Business School in the Strategy and Entrepreneurship Department. What my research looks at is the relationship between investors and firms, and the ways in which investors influence firms on environmental, social and governance issues. And as Donato mentioned, I'm very interested in the SDGs. What I'll be focusing on today is a range of different actors and how they interact with the SDGs. So I'm going to be talking about some of the research that has come out of business schools, especially in the more recent years, but also I'm involved in some activist groups here in London. So I'll give you some examples of activism that actually goes on around decent work in particular, and then some of the work that investors have been doing. And Victor touched on that. Aviva Investors is one of those groups that actually gets quite involved on shareholder activism to do with decent work. So in terms of what I'll be talking about in the next 10 minutes or so, is to provide those three different perspectives. So first of all, the business school academia side, then looking at living wage in particular from NGOs and CSOs, and then finally the investor angle there. So sustainable development has been something, and the SDGs has been something which a lot of different scholars have looked at, particularly those who are interested in anthropology, in health, environment, and the like. But there hasn't been so much from the management community or the business school community. But the good news is that that is changing. So in 2016, the editors of the Academy of Management journal, so this is the top journal in management, they actually wrote an editorial calling for more research on what they call grand challenges. And the framework they used there was the SDGs. So they were really specifically highlighting the SDGs as a framework for more research to be done. And what's happened since then is that actually last year there was a call for submissions for a special issue of the Academy of Management Discovery. So that went through last year, and hopefully we'll see that coming out in the next year or so. So it is good to see that business schools and scholars are recognising that maybe they can contribute to understanding how the Sustainable Development Goals can work, and then also how businesses can contribute to the SDGs. I'll give you a couple of examples now focused on SDG8 and focused on decent work in particular. And so there's a couple of broad areas where academics in business schools have engaged with SDG8. Those two, broadly speaking, are workers' rights within supply chains, and then pay practices to do with inequality. So the first example I'll talk about very briefly is some work by Juliana Riega and Jimmy Dohe. So Juliana's now at King's College London, and Jimmy's still at Warwick. And what they look at is the aftermath of the Rana Plaza disaster in 2013, and how unions came together with labour rights activists, also with consumers, to form the Accord for Fire and Safety in Bangladesh, fire and building safety in Bangladesh. And by forming this coalition, they actually convinced over 180 different apparel and fashion brands to sign up to the Accord. So it's really highlighting how collective action on labour rights by a range of different actors can help improve working conditions. And so that was a really important earlier paper in this research. Since then, Juliana and other colleagues have done some more work on global supply chains, and what they're highlighting is that we need to move away from this view of the supply chain as just a bunch of economic transactions. We really need to think about the individuals involved in this, the people who are involved, including consumers, workers, and managers, and how they talk to each other, how they try to see the world from each other's perspectives. Because once they do that, then they can understand, well, okay, this is a sort of practice which consumers might be concerned about, or these are the limitations that managers might have in providing decent work. So by bringing those actors together in these conversations and moving away from that view of transactions as just an economic exchange, but rather a social exchange, it will hopefully enable different stakeholders to see how decent work is affected by their individual behaviours. Another study which was done by Yong Kim and Jerry Davis at University of Michigan looks at sustainability reporting, specifically to do with conflict minerals. Mm-hmm. And they're trying to understand why certain firms are able to trace these different work practices within their supply chain. So it's very aligned with what Victor was talking about in terms of the complexity of supply chains and the number of suppliers that are being used, and then how that affects the ability to monitor the labour conditions within those supply chains. And what they find is that firms that excessively outsource and that are very geographically dispersed find it very difficult to certify the workers, the welfare conditions of their workers. And so they're arguing that maybe these organisations need to take more control and be more active in the monitoring of their supply chains and working conditions within their supply chain, very much in the same way that Victor was mentioning just then. And then a third study points to work on income inequality and how firms really drive the way that income inequality is shaped at the economy-wide level. So really, what Adam Cobb from University of Pennsylvania is arguing is that firms have a lot of choices they can make in terms of how they treat their employees, how they evaluate their employees. So his main argument is that if firms focus their evaluation by looking at external comparisons, so how much would my employee be paid at another company, then that is more likely to lead to inequality rather than if they just look at the quality of the output of the individual employee. So are they actually achieving the goals that I've set out there? But this also highlights the interaction between SDG8 in terms of decent work and SDG10 on reducing inequalities. And actually Donato mentioned before also the interaction there with other SDGs to do with production consumption, but then also to do with gender inequality. So it is very much interrelated. So moving away from the business school context and moving away from academia, I also see a lot of very interesting research coming out from the NGO community and from civil society as well. And one area that I've been very interested in is about the living wage. So Victor again mentioned the principle of the living wage, but the whole point here is that it's not just about focusing on people having jobs, but it's really about the quality of those jobs. So one concern that I have to do with SDG8 is that it really mixes in this decent work component with economic growth. And if we just view economic growth and the relationship to employment through unemployment, then we're kind of missing the more detailed effect on people's day-to-day ability to simply survive. And that's some of the work that, some of the things that Oxfam points to in their work. So they have a report here which looks at a number of case studies across a range of sectors. That includes fruit picking and factory work. And they highlight how it doesn't matter how hard employees work, it doesn't matter how long their hours are, if you pay them low wages and if there aren't adequate grievance mechanisms in place to protect their rights, then those employees stay in poverty. So they suggest that one way to overcome this obviously is for better governance within organisations, but then also to pay the living wage, pay a wage where people can actually survive and not live in poverty. In the developed world, developed country context, You've got work by the Living Wage Foundation here in the UK. And so Aviva, what I'm very happy to hear, is signed up to the Living Wage accreditation. There's currently 3,000 living wage accredited employees in the UK, and that covers about 1.3 million employees. And so survey work by the Living Wage Foundation found that accredited employers see reputational benefits, but then also they see benefits in terms of recruiting and retaining their staff. So what this highlights is that providing decent work, providing a living wage can actually be good for firms as well from a financial perspective. Very close to my heart is an organisation called Share Action, and they're an NGO, but what they do is, I think, very interesting, where they actually buy shares in the FTSE 100 companies, and they go along to the annual general meetings of these companies, and they ask questions of management and the board of directors about things like the living wage. In fact, I went to an AGM a couple of weeks ago where I was actually asking about whether the firm in question was willing to pay the living wage. So it's good to see that these organisations aren't just using their typical campaigning and writing reports, but they're also engaging with firms by using those capital market mechanisms, such as buying shares and then asking questions. Now, the good news is that with this campaign by Share Action in association with the Living Wage Foundation, we now have 37 FTSE 100 firms that are living wage accredited. And Share Action is also doing work on the Workforce Disclosure Initiative, which is also of interest to investors because they want to understand how these firms disclose their risks to do with their workforce. And then finally, mainstream investors are also very interested in this. So you mentioned before about Aviva, but the UN Principles of Responsible Investment is trying to coordinate all these different investors to focus on engaging with firms. So the UN Principles for Responsible Investment includes, I think, about 1,500 different investors, including pension funds and asset managers, covering around $90 trillion in assets. And some examples of the work they've done include engaging with firms in the apparel sector and also in the extractive sector to highlight some of the concerns that these investors have to do with reputational risks, regulatory risks, but then also arguing for things like the living wage and women's rights. So as a quick summary, there is work in business schools, in the academic side, to engage more with the SDGs, and a lot of that has centered around decent work. NGOs and CSOs are continuing to push companies to really think about how they can improve their workers' lives. And then investors as well, which I think is a bit surprising, are really pushing as well. And in some cases, they are collaborating with those NGOs. The bottom line for me, in a quick summary of all this work, is that there's lots of opportunity for collaboration between all of these different actors. So you have the academics, you have NGOs and civil society, you have investors, you have the firms, you have consumers. We all have a part to play in promoting this SDG and trying to help achieve decent work for everyone. So thanks a lot for that.
Fantastic. Thank you, Kevin. And I'm happy to see that our speakers really are on time. So we have plenty of time now for questions. And so I received a couple of questions in the group chat, but I actually want to start with a question that I already have in mind for Victor. So you mentioned a lot of engagement and assessment that you do along your supply chain, but once you identify those checks that are red flags for you, then what is the next action point for your organization? How do you engage with the suppliers to make a change, or you drop the relationship with the supplier? What's the action point there?
Thank you, Donato. So the process goes this way. We identify the supplier, we engage with the supplier so that they know that we would like to come and have a conversation. We have the conversation, take notes, and etc. We go away, draft the report, look at it internally. We identify areas that are areas for improvement. We also provide a form of a risk assessment of the supplier, and then we share this report with the supplier because we want to have transparency. So the report we see internally is the same report that we share with the supplier. And this is important because different corporates have different approaches in this area. Some of them like to have a report that is only for internal consumption, where you have the more candid views, where you have the more critical sort of areas for action. Some others just have a meeting and that's it. What we chose to do is just to be as open as possible. It doesn't mean that if in the future we come out with something that is truly serious, that we might not reassess our approach depending on the potential consequences, obviously. So once we send this report to the supplier, we ask the supplier for feedback, and the recommendations that we have go from things where we say we would like you to do this to things where we say we would like you to consider applying this. So the consider ones are things where we think the supplier could benefit for making some changes, but they are not necessarily a deal breaker. And things where we would say we would like you to do these within this period of time are things where we think we would like to have a bit more of a go and potentially a more decisive action. So to give you an example, if we, talking to a supplier, discover that they have employees working for Aviva at Aviva premises and that they are not paying the living wage, then we would say we need to solve this immediately. So you'll have a month, or we will have a month to sort this out, because it's not just the supplier doing that, but it's also on our side, making sure that that's clarified, that if we haven't adjusted the payments that we make to the supplier, we adjust them so that everything goes smoothly. Because that's another point. It's not just about telling the supplier you need to pay more, but it's also understanding that if the supplier needs to pay more, we might need to pay more. And it's also a compromise in there. So if, and this hasn't happened yet because we just, as I said, we are early on in the trial in this approach with suppliers, but if in the following assessments we come across something that requires immediate action, and if we ask the supplier to act on it, and the supplier does not act on the recommendations, then we will need to move into considering whether we trigger any contractual penalties that we may have. And potentially, as you would do with investments, after we have done, taking different steps for engagement, if necessary, we would look at terminating the contract. But that hasn't happened yet. We are early on in the process, and we will learn as we go.
Fantastic. I think this really brings to life a bit the application of those checks there. And so for Kevin, I also have a question for you from my side. You presented, you gave a very comprehensive perspective of what academia focused on in relation to modern slavery, and also what are the other relevant voices in terms of NGOs and investors there. But from your research perspective, what you feel are the gaps in this field, or if there are any areas in relation to decent work in general that you believe you see that are under researched? And I guess this is the first part of the question. The second part is more, we also have corporate here today. So to what extent do you believe that the outcome of the research is really used by corporate? Are they paying attention to what you're studying?
Yeah, I think that's two really good questions. I think one area where academics, I think, could focus a bit more is moving away from, academics in business schools tend to focus a lot on the effect that it has on profitability and financial performance of organizations, but we're not really looking that much in terms of, well, what is the outcome actually then on your employees in terms of their well-being, their happiness. There's a bit of work on that at the micro level, but it's probably still something which could be done a lot more. But then also what actually enables people across organizations to talk to each other, understand what working conditions are like in that other organization, and how can we bring those ideas into any given organization. So it's that cross within the industry, cross firm collaboration, which I think is interesting and could be studied a bit more. But yeah, there is that inherent bias there. Sorry, I forgot about your second question there. If you could just re-clarify that.
Yeah, the second question was more about, is really business, corporate world listening to the outcome of the research?
Yeah, so with that one, I think yes and no. I think it's nice to see the examples from Victor, because that is a really tangible one where I can see that there might have been some influence somewhere from the academic research. But I think one of the challenges we face academia in general is that we tend to lag what's going on in industry, and we tend to lag what's going on from NGOs. And so that's why I think we're still starting to understand what is the role that we can play in trying to encourage this. So a couple of examples there. One is that London Business School has now set up the Wheeler Institute for Business and Development. So we're starting to put more resources to understanding how business can contribute to sustainable development. But then also there's a coalition of business schools now and other educators that are coming together and trying to promote responsible management. And so you'll see more and more of these courses integrated into MBA programs, undergraduate programs, which really focus on the workforce and maintaining good conditions for employees.
Good, fantastic. So I'll get some of the questions from the audience now, and please keep writing those, or our speakers can also hear you. So if you want to take the word and ask a question directly, I think we can allow that. So this question is quite interesting because it's really related to the experience that our learning group has. One of the learning activities that we had in the past in the project was in Matera, which is a city in the south of Italy. If you haven't been there, I suggest you to go. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It's very nice. But Matera is also the second biggest reception center for asylum seeker in Europe. So essentially, there a lot of asylum seekers arrive, and then they seek their own path, to a better life. And what we saw there is that often spirals down in forms of modern slavery and forced labor. So in your opinion, who are the actors that should be at the table taking this challenge? I reckon that this is a broader question than your perspective, and it's more related to your opinions. But as experts and members of academia and corporate, I think you can share your views on that. So who wants to go first? That's a tough one.
Kevin.
I was going to let.
I'll let you.
Yeah, I'll let you go. Oh, okay. All right. I was going to leave it to you, Victor, because it's specifically about modern slavery. I think the example from what I mentioned before in response to the Bangladesh Accord and the Rana Plaza disaster kind of highlights that if you have actors from lots of different perspectives, then that can actually put more pressure on change in this respect. So in this specific case, I don't know it well enough, but I'm thinking that yes, the firms who are doing the hiring need to be involved, but they also need the support of the local community. They also need the support of their investors and the support of consumers. So if they do that, then they're going to be able to not pay below a minimum wage. They're actually going to provide an adequate wage for them. But they also need to interact with the government to make sure the government allows them to more easily hire asylum seekers, because in many countries that's quite difficult.
Fantastic, thank you. Victor, you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I would say that's very important, because one of the challenges that we have at the moment is that, in a way, it is very good that corporates are being pressured to do more, because we, there's been many years where we have not really paid attention to some of the obligations in terms of respecting human rights, through our operations and etc. There were many years where that was, first of all, that obligation was not clear, and etc. But there is also risk, when the pendulum swings, you go from one extreme where corporates are sort of not really looked at, to another one where we expect to do almost everything.
Yeah.
And there is always a risk that government also relies on that.
Yeah.
And you might find yourself in a place where government, in a way, resigns to their obligations because corporates are being asked to do this and being asked to do that. So we need to be very careful on that. And that's why what Kevin mentioned is very important, which is cross-sectoral collaboration.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just about those suppliers, those companies hiring these people, but it's also about, working across with NGOs. It's also about the labor authority of the area. Why is this the case? Also looking at if these people are being hired at this level. Why is that? Is that because the supplier is trying to exploit them, or is it because the supplier is trying to give them a job, but doing it on full terms would mean that they will need to probably incur a much higher cost, because many of these immigrants do not have papers, that allow them to come into the system in a way that a national and local could. So what are the transaction costs and etc.? So I would say, yes, companies need to take responsibility. Yes, those who work with those companies who are hiring these people should also be paying attention to it. But also, yes, civil society, NGOs, and the local government should take, responsibility for it.
Fantastic. It's a collective responsibility. If we want to make a change, we need to bring different actors to the table, which is in the end also one of the key principles of the goals. SDG 17 is partnership for the goals, and if with no partnership, with no cooperation, we will never reach those goals. And then, so we have the last 4 minutes, and I think there is a fantastic question to close our debate, because it's really looking into the future. And the question is, are automation and local production, for example, a new speed factory of Adidas in Germany, factors that will disrupt global supply chains and reduce the risk of labor violation substantially by 2030? So that's a specific question, I would say, but the themes of local production and automation are one of the main emerging issues of those conversations.
Yes, and I have a very I have a very personal view on these, is that automation can be really good, but can also be disastrous if you don't apply it in a in a responsible, in a planned way. Why? Because yes, you might reduce the risk of labor violations because you have not many workers, as everything is being automated, and that's the biggest problem with automation is that when you think about it, you need to think about the workforce of the future as well. You know, as a company, the easiest thing to do is I have 100 employees who work in the factory floor. I have this new technology who can do the work of these 100 employees. I'm just going to adopt that new technology because that's going to save costs and etc. etc. But I don't necessarily think what's going to happen to the 100 employees that I have on the floor. And that is not a responsible approach. And that's something that we are asking more of companies. Is thinking, if you know this is going to happen, what are you doing to make sure that people are upskilled, that people are placing other roles, and etc. Because automation should, the ideal view is that automation contributes to enhance the work that you provide, not completely replaces you. And I would say in terms of also future trends, blockchain will potentially have a good impact in this area. Automation in itself, yes, it's important, but I would say big data and artificial intelligence are going to be massive disruptors in this, and they could be really good to prevent or to improve labor conditions, but they can also be a massive risk to employment. Full stop.
Fantastic.
Kevin,
Kevin.
I don't really have anything to add on the automation front. I agree with a lot of what Victor was just saying, but in terms of the local production part of that question, well, I think yes, you will, by having local production and production which is close to the consumer, then yes, you're going to have better monitoring and potentially the risk of fewer labour violations. The problem with that though is that you're then potentially taking away high value add jobs from countries where they actually need those jobs. And so instead of moving from, say, a factory in Bangladesh or from Thailand and bringing it into Germany, in terms of my personal preference would be that those jobs stay there, but that adequate monitoring is put in place, that instead of Adidas outsourcing to another supplier, maybe Adidas owns that factory and those workers in those factories are Adidas employees, and they can buy into everything that company does, rather than having 5 or 10 different suppliers who change every couple of months.
Fantastic. So I see that we reached the top of the hour. And if I may add my 2 cents on automation to, as you know, I work in technology and also machine learning as well. I think that will, of course, disrupt supply chains and the labor market in general. But my perspective is that we are very far from having, artificial intelligence that will really replace some of the critical elements of human intelligence, specifically critical thinking and creative thinking. You can ask and you can teach a machine to solve simple problems in the context of certain assumptions, but when it comes to become creative and go beyond those assumptions, then you need a human to do it. All right. With these concluding remarks and beautiful answers on the topic on automation and technology, I think we can close the session. Thank you for our speakers to your contributions, your views, your time. I can see there are also many other questions coming in. So if you don't mind, I can send you these via email, and then you can reply to those in more detail. But thank you again for joining today, and also I hope our audience enjoyed our webinar. So
thank you very much again, and have a good rest of the day.
Thanks a lot, and thanks for the great questions as well.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks.